Late in his reign, the architect of Judea's greatest monuments rarely saw the sun. King Herod lived in the deep shadows of his own palace, consumed by suspicion, surrounded by the ghosts of wives and sons he had already executed. Across the Mediterranean, his eldest son, Antipater, was sailing home from Rome in a state of total confidence. He believed his forged letters and smuggled poisons had cleared his path, and he was returning to finally claim the crown he had spent years maneuvering for. But he was sailing into a vacuum. Months earlier, his co-conspirator had been captured and tortured, confessing everything to the king. Antipater was now the only man in the empire who didn't know he was already doomed. When he arrived in Judea, the isolation was immediate. His massive entourage was turned away at the gates, which were physically shut behind him. He walked the silent corridors alone, separated from his allies for the first time. Assuming the role of a loving heir, Antipater stepped forward to embrace his father. But Herod physically recoiled, throwing his hands up in revulsion to block the touch. The historical record captures the exact accusation. Herod stretched out his hands, turned his head away, and cried out that this very embrace was the sign of a parricide. He forbade Antipater from laying a finger on him until his crimes were answered. The king, who had raised massive fortresses across the region, had just completed his most effective construction. He had engineered a psychological prison, and his son had walked willingly into the center of it. The next day, Herod convened a tribunal overseen by the Roman president of Syria. Yet the king didn't project the image of a powerful monarch. He sat before the court as a broken, weeping father, mourning the ruin of his own family line. He openly cursed his surviving son's monstrous nature. According to the text, Herod lamented his own wretched children and condemned Antipater to his face as a profligate wild beast. The prosecution quickly moved from emotional appeals to hard proof. They produced the box Antipater had smuggled from Egypt, a chemical mixture intended for the king's own cup. To prove the substance was lethal, the court brought out a condemned prisoner. He was forced to drink the liquid and died almost instantly in front of the assembly. Antipater was thrown into the palace dungeons to await execution, but the order never came. The king's physical health began a sudden, violent decline, stalling the final sentence. The political poison of the court had been identified and locked in a cell, but the biological poison inside the king was just beginning to take its toll. The delay in the execution fed a rumor that spread like wildfire. With Herod unseen and orders slowing, whispers throughout the city claimed the king was already dying. Scholars seized on the rumor, inciting young men to launch a religious rebellion at the holiest site in the kingdom. They targeted a massive golden eagle Herod had erected over the Great Gate. To the rebels, it was a tyrannical sacrilege, and the historical text details how the scholars exhorted the youth to cut it down to defend their ancient laws. The reports of his death were premature. Pushed by spite, Herod rallied enough strength to arrest the leaders and had them burned alive. This final act of mass violence broke his remaining stamina. Immediately after the executions, his physical body underwent a total collapse. The symptoms recorded were visceral. What started as a fever escalated into agonizing colon pain and an inflammation of the abdomen so severe that it produced worms from his living flesh. The suffering was so extreme that his own diviners declared the decay was a direct punishment for what the king had done to the rabbis at the temple. The supreme power Herod used to burn his subjects could not protect him from the microscopic rot consuming his own skin. Confined to his bed and gasping for air, the king was driven to madness by the unendurable pain of his failing body. Desperate for an escape, Herod requested an apple and a paring knife. The record shows he looked around to ensure no one was watching, then lifted his right hand to drive the blade into his own chest. His cousin Archiabus sprinted across the room to stop the suicide. The struggle triggered a massive, panicked wail of grief that echoed through the entire palace. Deep in the dungeon, Antipater heard the screaming and assumed his father was finally dead. He immediately began trying to bribe his guards, offering them a fortune for his freedom. The guards instead reported the betrayal directly to Herod. A surge of rage briefly revived the king, who gave the order to execute Antipater instantly. With his last strength, Herod altered his will to name a different successor, effectively erasing his eldest son's legacy. The king outlived his son by only 5 days. Following his death, his remains were placed upon a purple bed and sealed inside a coffin of solid gold, embroidered with precious stones. They carried that gem-studded shell out to the desert fortress of Herodium. Inside, a body that had spent weeks being consumed by worms was sealed away in a monument designed to be timeless. Herod spent his life carving his name into stone mountains and golden cities. Yet in his final days, his world had shrunk to the size of a sickbed. He had built for the ages, only to die a prisoner to his own rot.